So let's now apply what we learned about transition, about this transition component, to our modal, because that was the thing where I explained that we might need more help from Vue's side, especially for having a transition and animation when we close it. Now we can wrap transition around our own custom components just as we can wrap it around built-in elements. So we can use transition here around our base modal just like that. Now we can of course also set the name prop to define our own prefix for all those special classes Vue will add. And I will add modal here. But again, you can pick any name you want. And then we can dig into our CSS code and start defining those CSS classes. And here I'll add a modal enter from class, a modal enter active class, and a modal enter to class. And I will actually go to base modal.vue and make sure that I remove the animation from the modal there so that we don't see this animation anymore. So make sure you comment this out or remove this line. And then let's go back to app.vue, which is where we're using the base modal and where we're wrapping it with transition. And now we can define our different styles here. And it's now, of course, totally up to you how you want to animate this modal. I will actually bring over my modal keyframes here. So the keyframes from the base modal.vue file. Add them here to app.vue. You can have multiple sets of keyframes in the same style tags as long as you're using different names. And I actually don't even need enter from and enter to now. We just need enter active to play an animation. And this will be the modal animation, which I just copied over. Give it a duration and an easing function. And if we do that, we'll notice a problem. If we reload, this modal has no animation. Now transition, this transition component, does work on custom components. But we have a problem here. The classes Vue wants to add are added to the root element of your custom component. This is this attribute fall through behavior I talked about earlier. So these classes transition wants to add fall through to the root element in the template of base modal. But base modal happens to have two root elements, this div and this dialog. If we comment out the div for a second, if we remove that div, the backdrop, for a second, and then reload, you see it works. Now we have this animation for showing the modal. But if we have both root elements here, which we of course want, then this does not work. And it doesn't work because, as I mentioned before, this transition component wants one direct child element. Yes, it has just one child element here, just one base modal, but of course the base modal here is really just a wrapper around its template where we have two root elements. So these two root elements, this div and this dialog, these are the actual direct child elements inside of this transition component. Well, and two elements are more than one. That's why this setup here does not work. What can we do about that? How can we work around that? Well, there are various ways of solving this. We can, for example, split this into two components and manage the backdrop separately. But we could also bring this transition component over to base modal and try using it in there to transition this dialog. And that's the route I will take here. I'll remove the transition wrapper around my custom component, though it theoretically would work if our custom component had just one root element, but here it doesn't, so it doesn't work. And I will bring it over to base modal and wrap this dialog with transition. Like this. Now I can give this a name of modal and go back to app view and grab my modal specific CSS classes, to be precise, the modal enter active class here. We can remove them from app.view, remove the modal keyframes from app.view, and bring all of that over to base modal view. There we already got the modal keyframes, and now I'm also adding the modal interactive class, which points at the modal keyframes to play it as an animation. Now, however, we need to change the logic how this base modal opens. At the moment, I'm adding the base modal component in app view with vIf. And this won't work if I want to use transition inside of the base modal template to animate the addition and removal of dialogue. If transition is part of that template which is added and removed with vIf, it won't have any effect. Therefore, I'll now open and close the modal differently. I'll add a new open prop to my base modal component and point at dialog is visible there. So forward the dialog is visible property through the open prop to the base modal component. And now in the base modal component, we can accept this prop here. So expect the open prop here. And now that we're getting it, we can simply add it here. With vIf, we can check open, so this open prop, which is true or false, to control whether or not the dialog is visible or not. So now the base modal component is always added to the app view template, but inside of that base modal template, the dialog is still controlled with vIf. But now it's wrapped in a transition, and now this transition has only one direct child. And of course, we also want to add vIf here to the div and pass the open prop to vIf here as well to control the visibility of the backdrop. And now finally, if we reload, we got this animation and everything works properly. And we can of course now also work on a closing animation. We can add modal leave active here and play the same animation, let's say with a ease in easing function, just to keep things simple. Of course, we could also play a totally different animation here or set up a transition by also using the from and to classes. But if I do it like that, if I now reload, we got an animation for opening and also for closing. Now the closing animation certainly is a bit off because I'm just reusing the opening animation. But we can add the reverse value here to this animation on modal leave active to tell CSS to actually play this animation in reverse for this case here, for this CSS class selector. So then it will start at to and go to from if you add reverse. And with that, if I save that and reload, we got a nice animation for opening and also for closing. And now that is enabled with help of transition, keeping in mind that transition must only have one direct child element, and therefore we had to restructure this a bit, and I hope it's clear why we had to do it. But with that, we now got a nice transition for opening and for closing, so for adding and for removing this element to the DOM. Now I'll dive into some cases where we actually are allowed to have more than one element inside of transition.